joining us this evening. My name is Audrey Lichter, and I'm the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholars Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual ritual development. The Scholars Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues which the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture will have a resource sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our scholar tonight is Dr. Andrew Pessin, Professor of Philosophy at Connecticut College and Campus Bureau Editor of the Allgemeiner, author of many books on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and cancel culture. Before I introduce Dr. Pessin, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. Q&A will be held about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email shortly and will also be available on our website, chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Andrew Pessin.
Hi, thank you, Audrey. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'd say it's a pleasure to be here, but the topic that necessitates this talk is not particularly pleasurable: how campuses turned against Jews, how campuses turned against Israel. To those who've been following campuses for some time, the trajectory against Israel and against the Jews has been clear for a good number of years, but even so, the intensity of the campus responses to October 7th, when the masks just fully came off and enormous campus rallies openly celebrated the mass slaughter of Jews, was still shocking. In this webinar tonight, we'll examine the long strategy by which this was accomplished that brought about this response. By means of a combination of lies, the BDS movement, and contemporary progressive ideology. Future webinars will do deeper dives into smaller parts of that. So let's get going. Who am I, first of all? So I am, as Audrey mentioned, professor of philosophy. About 9 years ago, I had my own experience with anti-Zionism. I essentially got canceled for standing up for Israel, and that was the moment I had my epiphany when I suddenly understood viscerally and clearly that the campus anti-Zionism just is a form of anti-Semitism, and once you see that, you cannot unsee it. And so in the past 9 years, I've really turned my work around to focus primarily on Jews and Israel-related matters. I started teaching Zionism and Jewish topics in my courses, introducing it into the curriculum. I started working for the Allgemeiner. I give you the website right there. It's a wonderful news outlet for all matters concerning Jews and Israel. I became the inaugural Campus Bureau Editor, which I still am to this day. So in that capacity, I keep a close eye on campuses. And I do urge everybody to go to the Allgemeiner website and sign up for the daily newsletter so you can stay informed, which is the first step towards doing anything, is to know what's going on. In 2018, I published the book Anti-Zionism on Campus on your screen, documenting how bad the problem was in 2018. It seems almost sweet and innocent now in comparison in the 5 years since. In 2021, I published the book Poisoning the Wells with colleagues, both of those, about anti-Semitism in America. It's actually coming out in a new edition. I think it just came out in a new edition, if you want to look for that. And unfortunately, couldn't be more timely, as anti-Semitism, both on campus and in America, is just absolutely raging. I also write novels, so just a quick plug. My newest novel just came out last week, Bright College Years. It's about what campuses used to be before they devolved into this madness of self-mockery that we are seeing today. So if you have a chance, check that out. You can find out more about me and my stuff at my website, andrewpessin.com. So why are we here today? Well, we're here because of October 7th, first and foremost. And for this audience, I don't need to rehearse what happened on October 7th, but it's important to keep some of the people in mind. And we all, I know, become attached to certain of the stories. And so we're here today because of the Kapshatar family on the left of your screen, all of whom were murdered on that day. We're here today because of the Kedem family in the middle of the screens, beautiful family, who were murdered along with his mother, Carol Simantov, age 70. Uh, uh, Yonatan's last text to his sister was, "They're here, they're burning us, we're suffocating." That was the last they heard from this beautiful family. And of course, we're here for the hostages, two of whom were fantastically rescued last night. Wonderful story, but 130 plus remain to go. So let's keep these folks in mind as we dive in. So we're here for these people, and we are here because of the campus response to October 7th by students, faculty, administrators alike. Instant, widespread support, celebration, jubilation, endorsement on many of all the major campuses. And this was even before Israel began its response several days later. So even while the massacre was still ongoing on that Saturday into the Sunday, campuses were celebrating. First out of the gate was a group of students at Harvard University. This statement was published Saturday afternoon, October 7th. Massacre was still ongoing, essentially blaming everything on Israel, saying these folks deserved it. They had it coming. And this again was signed. There was a coalition, something like 33 or 34 different student groups signed this statement Saturday afternoon, October 7th. Within a day or two, starting the 7th, 8th, 9th, faculty members, faculty responses. Here's just a small sample. In the upper left, you see Professor Russell Rickford of Cornell University, who gave a speech talking about how exhilarating October 7th was. Upper right, renowned, infamous Columbia professor Joseph Massad called the massacres awesome and astounding. In the bottom left, NYU's Professor Eve Tuck called October 7th life and future affirming. And CUNY, well-known anti-Semitic professor Mark Lamont Hill, now at CUNY, points out that decolonization isn't just a theory. We'll talk a little bit about this ideology, but the point was we've all been talking about decolonization as an idea. It's not just a theory. This massacre was a manifestation of it, and therefore we should all support it. As for a little more detail about some of the student responses. Again, even before Israel began its campaign going after Hamas in those first few days, various student groups led by Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, we'll be talking more about them in a little bit, openly held rallies on numerous campuses celebrating and endorsing the slaughter. They praised the resistance, which is their sanitized name for violent terrorism against unarmed combatants. They praised the resistance, and then they immediately mobilized to bring a day of resistance, the same week, the first week, a day of resistance to campuses everywhere, which is simply literally an open call for violence, right? They call the massacre resistance. They say, let's bring resistance to every campus. And in case you were unclear, they illustrate it with that the hang glider, the homicidal hang gliders right there. And this was going on numerous campuses, these massive rallies. You see on the upper left something called the CUNY Jewish Law Students Association. They don't ever release the names of their members. It's not at all clear that these are Jewish students. They might be, unfortunately. But they posted a photo of 4 elderly residents who had been massacred and declared, "We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people." You can't openly endorse violence any more clearly than that. We see the Black Lives Matter Chicago and several other Black Lives Matter chapters as also present on campuses. We stand with Palestine, again illustrated with the homicidal hang glider. The chants at these various rallies are absolutely vile, of course. So when a people is occupied, resistance is justified, justifying the slaughter. Endless chants of intifada, intifada revolution, globalize the intifada, of course, being the word for massive violence against Jewish civilians. And of course, the very important phrase, by any means necessary, present at every single one of these rallies. Whatever the Palestinians need to do to achieve their aims, and that can be mass murder of babies, is acceptable. So they're good with these activities by any means necessary. Here's some pictures of a few campuses, just so you get a sense of what these rallies look like. Literally taking over campuses everywhere. The response only got more heated and elevated as this semester went on. Once Israel began its military response, began with airstrikes after a few days, and then after several weeks, the invasion, of course. And at that point, the focus of these rallies can change a little bit to protesting Israel's response. But let's not forget that the celebration of the massacre itself preceded by days and days and days any objections to Israel's response. So we saw on all these campuses endless angry rallies, disruptions of classes, takeovers of administrative buildings, harassment of Jewish students, vandalism of Jewish symbols and institutions, Chabad houses and Hillel houses vandalized left and right, mezuzahs torn down from dorm rooms, Israeli flags set on fire, buildings defaced with graffiti. There are a good number now of physical assaults. Jews have been punched and kicked and spat on, Jewish students barricading themselves in libraries and classrooms against angry mobs pounding on the windows and doors. The Harvard Chabad was told that they could not leave their oversized menorah outside over Hanukkah overnight because Harvard couldn't protect it. This is an institution with a $50 billion endowment, and they couldn't assign a person to stand watch over the menorah overnight. Clockwise here, by the way, we're looking at Harvard, starting upper left, Harvard, University of Chicago, University of Michigan, and Columbia. Blank slide. I should have introduced that. What was the administrative response? Blank slide, right? Essentially nothing. With very rare exceptions, administrators said almost nothing in those opening days. My own institution, not a word from the administration until almost a week later. And when they did finally speak, it was these mealy-mouthed statements objecting to all forms of hate, anti-Semitism, and of course, Islamophobia. Basically saying all lives matter, right? All lives matter. We just had this massive massacre of Jews, and the statements are not condemning the massacre as terrorism, showing support for Judaism, but just condemning all hate because all lives matter. This also goes for the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion folks. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. They essentially had nothing to say. There was an article in Tablet surveying all the major DEI offices, and they said nothing about this massacre. And we'll talk about why not a little bit shortly. The result of all this, lawsuits galore. I don't know if that's a good thing or a tragic thing, or both. The Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education, which oversees what's called the enforcement of Title VI, which basically any entity receiving federal funds is not allowed to discriminate on the basis of protected characteristics. As of a couple weeks ago, had 99 open investigations, the overwhelming majority of which had been filed after October 7th, primarily complaints about anti-Semitism on these campuses. So this is a massive set of investigations ongoing. And on top of that, there's all sorts of individual lawsuits. Individuals or individual groups have filed serving as plaintiffs in various lawsuits. So we see here, there's a Jewish group suing Berkeley. Rutgers law student is suing Rutgers. And here we see just the front pages of several of the prominent lawsuits that have been filed just in the last few weeks. Going clockwise from upper left, the Art Institute of Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, Harvard, and then New York University. This is just a small sample. There's at least another half dozen major lawsuits like this. And these are available online. I do recommend people check them out and read them. And it's a horror story as they document usually years of anti-Semitic incidents, but culminating post-October 7th in just really an endless assault against Jews. So here's what's happening, and here's where we are, to summarize. Campuses have become overwhelmingly hostile towards Jewish students to the point that Jews are essentially being driven from universities in America, North America, and elsewhere. Even apart from and before the past few months of these open celebrations of the mass murder of Jews, there has been ongoing harassment of Jewish students, swastikas galore, endless swastikas on every campus for years now, open demands to get Zionists off campus. Just this past week at Birmingham University in the UK, they were chanting death to Zionists on a campus. Many episodes of Jewish groups being excluded from coalitions. NYU a couple of years back had 53 student groups announce that they would have nothing to do with the two Jewish groups on campus. Berkeley Law School did something similar just last year. Numerous cases of individual Jewish students being kicked out of groups, typically these progressive groups, like a sexual assault survivors group said, you can't, to one young woman, you can't be part of this group. She founded the group, but they kicked her out because she was a Zionist. She supported Israel. At Columbia, 2 months ago, a lesbians group openly announced they would not accept, it's a lesbian support group of some sort. They would not accept any Zionist, anyone who endorsed Zionism, which is essentially the large majority of Jews and Jewish students. Ivy Leagues have been notoriously dropping the percentage of Jewish students they admit. A generation ago, Harvard and Yale had something like 20 to 25% Jewish students in their populations, and similar numbers amongst faculty. Today, they're down to Yale class of 2022 was only 10% Jewish, and Harvard's class of 2020 was only 6% Jewish. The Harvard lawsuit, by the way, when you read it, claims that Harvard adopted an explicit policy to shrink the number of Jews. So that's one of the tenets of that lawsuit. University of Pennsylvania went from approximately 33% Jewish students to something like 15 or 16% now. And we see that in these headlines, the vanishing Ivy League Jew and the Jewish population at Ivy League schools declining, literally being driven from the most prestigious universities, and when they filter into other universities, attacked and harassed. All of this is painfully captured by this observation by Vassar Russian history professor Michaela Pohl, who wrote in 2016, "The atmosphere at Vassar is troubled. I am not Jewish, but even I have experienced an increase in hostility and strained silences among students and colleagues. I've been called a, fucking fascist, Zionist, and idiot for speaking out against Vassar's BDS resolution. I have seen Jewish students profiled and singled out at a BDS meeting. I have felt the icy silence that reigns in some departments. Academics who suggest that Israel is harvesting organs, that's a libel that's reappeared during the current war, by the way. These academics suggesting that earn approving tweets and clicks. It is and deal in hate speech that angers and mobilizes, that relishes its effects, but denies that the effect was ever the intention. And as for the long-term effects of such an environment, Pohl noted that, quote, students look down at their desks when I say things about Jewish emancipation in Russia. There are embarrassed silences in class while discussing Jewish history. At best, on so many campuses, the best campuses, the most elite, the most prestigious, and even working your way down, Jews are becoming persona non grata at best, and at worst, are vilified, ostracized, attacked, and even driven out. That's America in 2023, the golden land. But what we're seeing is actually an old story dressed up fresh for the 20th and 21st century. So we're going to ask the question, how did this happen? How did we get to this really unbelievable place? As I mentioned, for those who've been watching, the trajectory has been clear for some time. By May of 2021, I understood thoroughly that campuses really hated the Jews. They went from not liking them to really, really hating them. But now it's clear, and I do believe, I'm a little bit of a pessimist, but I do believe this seriously. It's clear that campuses actually want to see Jews dead. We now know this. I published this article, as you see, on October 22nd, just 2 weeks after the massacre, when I was watching campus responses to the massacre, which I assumed would be, overwhelmed in horror and outrage and condemnation. But when you see campus rallies celebrating, supporting, endorsing, and calling for more of the same, I understood. They want us dead. My own institution came to me after I published this and said, "Do you feel safe on this campus?" And I said, "No, I don't." And it's not because there's been any particular incident on my campus, but when you look at this type of response, it's hard to conclude anything other than they want you dead. I will suggest that what we're seeing now, as we try to explain how this happened, how this came to be, it's best explained by a confluence of two major movements that have utterly come to dominate campuses in the past 2 decades, as reflected in these abbreviations: BDS SJP and CRT DEI. I'm sure those are probably familiar to most of this audience. We'll talk about each one. So as for BDS, that's the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement, SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine. The long history of the BDS movement goes all the way back to 120 or more years to the initial Arab opposition to Zionism in the land of Israel. But we'll start our story in the year 2001, when the United Nations held a conference, not coincidentally in Durban, South Africa, which South Africa recently brought Israel to the International Court of Justice. This UN conference was supposed to be a conference, an anti-racism conference, a conference against racism. It devolved into an openly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel hate fest, including distributing copies of the notorious anti-Semitic forgery, the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, to conference attendees. It essentially relaunched the libel that Zionism is racism. That was a Soviet-inspired thing in the 60s and 70s. It relaunched that idea. And it was here that the strategy of labeling Israel as an apartheid state was hatched and spread. And it relaunched the Arab boycott into an international boycott movement. So basically, the modern version of the boycotting of the Jews begins here in 2000 in South Africa. It led almost immediately after this conference, some UK universities started announcing academic boycotts of Israeli institutions and individuals. Within a couple of years, the official BDS movement launched in 2005. Was allegedly this call from Palestinian civil society that the international community should boycott, divest from, and issue sanctions upon Israel. So this is the 2005 launch, and then it begins to spread and take over campuses at an accelerating rate. I have on the bottom right sort of the central organization which coordinates the international BDS movement. You can go check out their website when they describe themselves and their goals and their aims and offer resources and strategy for whoever wants to go along. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The main mechanism on campuses, the main people who perpetrate the BDS campaign on campuses is this organization, a student group called Students for Justice in Palestine. Each of the individual chapters typically has their own logo. I'll give a very brief history of this group. It was founded in 1993 on the Berkeley campus. It was actually the continuation of an earlier movement that was called, I think, the General Union of Palestinian Students. It was meant to make it seem less like a Palestinian thing and more like an international thing. So it became Students for Justice in Palestine. And the as you see on the slide on the right, American University chapter of SJP, it's pretty clear what they want. They want to replace Israel with Palestine. That is the basic idea. But they didn't come right out and say that so clearly anyway, explicitly at first. They started to grow. In 2011, they had their first national conference, and I'll mention now they're up to over 200 chapters in North America. So there's 200 or more campuses now that have SJP chapters on them, and they've had an annual national conference since 2011. First one was at Columbia, also not a surprise. It's a real ground zero for a lot of hate there. And they issued their points of unity, essentially laying out what their goals were here. Students for Justice in Palestine works in solidarity with the Palestinian people and supports their right to self-determination. It is committed to, and this is the main program now, committed to ending Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the separation wall. It recognizes the rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. It calls for respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes, the so-called right of return. On that subject, everyone should read Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz's recent book, The War of Return, which is about the UNRWA and the alleged right of return and how that's been weaponized. It couldn't be more timely with the revelations about UNRWA, so I strongly recommend that book. So this is the plan or program, but you'll note it's initially coded politely. It's like a civil rights group. We're about the equal rights for the Palestinian people. Who could be opposed to equal rights for all people? But as you think a little bit about what they're demanding, you realize they're calling for the destruction of Israel as a Jewish state. In their mind, all of Israel is occupied and colonized Arab lands, and so they want to overthrow that. And the so-called right of return is, in their view, a demand to have 6-7 million Palestinians return to Israel proper, which would obviously destroy it as a Jewish majority and as a Jewish state. So they started off somewhat coded and politely framing their desire to destroy the Jewish state of Israel, but that's gone now. Over time, within the past few years, and certainly, as I said, the masks are off from October 7th. They don't hide anything anymore. They openly call for the replacement of Israel by Palestine by any means necessary. So they're good with the terrorism, they're good with the violence. At their rallies, they chant things like, "We don't want two states, we want 1948," i.e., before the partition, which helped establish the Jewish state. The slogan, much in the news of late, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," was, by the way, originally a Hamas slogan. And in Arabic, the slogan runs a little bit differently. It's "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab," which is literally unambiguous. And they're chanting that now on campuses. In fact, just this afternoon, there was a rally at Harvard, and the students were chanting in English, I believe. I didn't listen to it. I saw the recording of it. They were chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab." So the masks are off. The masks are off. Some will ask about who funds it. It's actually pretty unclear what the source of funding is, so I don't unfortunately have information about that. And as I mentioned, 200+ chapters, so they're everywhere now. And every week or two, another chapter forms on another campus. What do they do on these campuses? Endless educational, i.e., propaganda events, speakers, films, activities, all academic year long. And most importantly, over the past something about 15 years now, there's an international movement to run what they call Israeli Apartheid Weeks on campuses. It's usually every spring. This year, it's just been announced it'll be the month of March. And so they're trying to get every single one of their chapters to run a whole week of these events. They typically construct an enormous apartheid wall in the middle of campus that they fill with all sorts of lies and misrepresentations. It's stunning that campuses actually allow this. They also are the main source of running BDS campaigns on campuses. So these typically take the form of introducing a resolution in student government that will support the Palestinians, condemn Israel, and call on the university to divest from Israel and to boycott Israel, et cetera, et cetera. And they fill up the whole academic year doing this. These are their activities. Every once in a while, they'll do a nice cultural thing, like you'll eat some traditional Palestinian food or do a Palestinian dance. Those are pretty harmless, but 90% of their activities, 95%, is really this onslaught of anti-Israel propaganda and these BDS campaigns. So what does all that really amount to? In one respect, the strategy here is nothing new. It's literally been years of lies and distortions and misrepresentations that are deliberately designed to delegitimize and dehumanize the Jew, to label the Jew as inhuman, demonic, pure evil. Once you're convinced that the Jew represents evil, then boycotting Jews, persecuting Jews, even killing Jews becomes not only acceptable, but obligatory. If the Jew is evil, then you, in turn, must be good in persecuting and killing him. The ancient and medieval Christians did this literally for centuries, portraying the Jew as the fleshly embodiment of evil for their rejection and crucifixion of Jesus. The Germans and Nazis did this for decades in racial terms, inspired and justifying their actions by the anti-Semitic forgery I mentioned earlier, Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was crucial in the Nazi movement, even developing, the Nazis did, a whole academic discipline to demonstrate the evils of the Jews and why they had to be resisted. They even used that language, and stamped out, thus inspiring the book title. There's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on the left. Max Weinreich wrote a book some years back, Hitler's Professors. They literally brought the professors in to create an academic discipline to document the evils of the Jews. After some decades of this program, persecuting killing actual living Jews isn't merely easier, but becomes an act of virtue. The newer lies are merely superficial variations on the older lies, aiming to better reflect the things that are specifically considered most evil today. So Zionism is racism. Racism is the biggest evil today in the West. The charges of genocide that Israel has committed and is continuing to commit, even in real time as we speak in Gaza, genocide, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, apartheid, and more recently, right out of Goebbels' playbook, he was the propaganda minister for the Nazis, the claim that Zionism is a movement of Jewish supremacy and that Israel is a state that manifests Jewish supremacy. Not to mention probably every single thing most people believe about Gaza as a so-called open air prison. All of these are lies. In fact, easily documentable, demonstrable lies for anyone who takes just a few minutes to honestly evaluate them. But the charges don't have to be true. They just have to be, was it Goebbels who famously said, just the goal, tell a really big lie and keep repeating it, and then people accept it after a while. They just have to be widely circulated, widely repeated, and widely believed so that the Jew becomes the embodiment of whatever is considered most evil today. And this is what the Palestinian movement, with its many progressive allies who we'll talk about momentarily, has successfully accomplished. After almost 20 years of the campus BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel, orchestrated by now 200 plus chapters of SJP, their short-term goal, their alleged goal of damaging Israel or pressuring Israel economically has been a total bust. Israel's economy has done just fine in the last 2 decades. But the long-term goal, which was the real goal, has succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Whether or not a particular BDS resolution passes or fails on a given campus, it's the campaign itself that soaks the campuses in these lies for weeks or months on end, year after year after year. Most students don't really follow the details. They're not particularly involved. They're not particularly informed, but they come away thinking, man, those Jews with their genocide, apartheid, and Jewish supremacy are really pretty evil. And so as we look at campus rallies, this as we see these lies being levied all over the place. There's the claim of Israeli apartheid in the upper right, calling for an end to settler colonial states, of which the only one they seem to care about is Israel, which, by the way, is not a settler colonial state, but that's a different issue. Bottom right, we see, I forget where I got this one from, but this is the claim that Israel is a reign of Jewish supremacy. And the bottom left, we see an image of a this was at Harvard, apartheid wall, what one of them happens to look like. And you see especially the claim on the left, Zionism is racism, settler colonialism. Here it's white supremacy, which, by the way, is as bad as Jewish supremacy, and also apartheid. So you've got all of them on that leftmost panel. The result of all of these lies now is that literally no one blinks an eye when SJP asserts baldly, as if factually, on recent social media celebrating October 7th, that every single Israeli Jew is a settler, even the ones who live within the internationally recognized borders of the UN member state of Israel, even the one whose lineage on that land might well trace back to biblical times. There have been Jews continuously in this land going back to biblical times. In today's campus vernacular, settler is a slur rivaling in evilness the slur Nazi, which they also, of course, levy against Israelis. So if every Israeli Jew is a settler, then every Israeli Jew is evil and therefore legitimately murdered. That includes the babies and the grandmothers and the unarmed dancing teenagers and the pregnant women. And it also justifies torturing and raping them before you murder them. Nor is an eye now blinked when George Washington University's SJP goes even further and openly declares that every Palestinian is a civilian, even if they hold arms. It's in the bottom right. And a settler is an aggressor, a soldier, and an occupier, even if they're lounging on our occupied beaches. The assault on language and intelligence here is almost as bad as the physical assault on Jewish civilians that it justifies. And what that means is that adorable little girl, sorry, this one's a little blurry, it was not a good screenshot, but that for a little while, the hostage posters, people were vandalizing them by taping the word occupier over them, which is just so offensive. I can't even speak. And so you've got a picture of a small girl, adorable small girl who was born in that land, to parents who were born in that land, to parents who were born in that land, maybe going all the way back to biblical times, splashing in the waves as her loving mother looks on. That little child is an aggressor, a soldier, an occupier, a settler. Might as well put a target right on her forehead, which of course is what Hamas did. Every Israeli Jew is guilty, and therefore any Jew around the world who supports the Israeli Jews, which is the significant majority of diaspora Jews, right, is also guilty, because you are supporting maximum evil. There are no innocent Jews. That's what this movement has produced, the belief that there are no innocent Jews. But even this is only part of the story. We turn now to the second tenet, the CRT DEI movement, that has taken over universities and industries, media, corporations, law, medicine, etc. It goes by various names: wokeness, critical race theory is CRT, anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion is DEI, but it now is absolutely dominant ideology over the large majority of campuses, and absolutely exploded after the George Floyd affair in 2020. It's been taking over since around 2010 for sure. The antagonism that this movement shows, not merely towards Israel, but towards Jews, is well documented. We'll give a very brief summary in just a second. I strongly recommend this book, Woke Anti-Semitism by David Bernstein, who just explains how this ideology is anti-Semitic in its core. And we see on the right, the recognition, the argument by Armin Rosen and Tablet, that the DEI complex, which governs universities, didn't merely fail to protect Jews in the response to October 7th, but it's institutionally structured so that it could not and will never protect Jews. So the basic tenets of this movement, let me add the qualifier. The intellectual development of these ideas actually has a lot of virtue. There's value, there's some really smart people and real problems that they were dealing with. So this summary is going to be very superficial, obviously, and brief. The way the ideas have trickled down into practice is really where the problem is. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Basic ideas: members of Western societies divide into two groups, oppressor and oppressed, determined primarily by race. White supremacy is understood as the fundamental evil responsible for all disparities between white people and marginalized people. Marginalized people include people of color, gay and lesbians, trans people, women, Latinos, disabled, and more. Wherever there are such disparities in things like income or health outcomes or education levels or incarceration rates, long list, those disparities are due to white privilege and systemic racism, where basically the oppressing whites are using various mechanisms to maintain their oppression over the marginalized folks. What they demand fundamentally is not equality of opportunity or equal rights, but equality of outcome. Anything else is considered racism or oppression. Indeed, I'll skip. I was going to elaborate on that a little bit. Maybe in the Q&A we can. Since equal outcome is the only acceptable goal, because anything else is racism, systemic racism, or oppression, they strongly incline towards adopting the motto, by any means necessary. If it was injustice that produces a system where some end up better off than others, then it's automatically justice to undo that system, even if by violent or revolutionary means. The outcome is the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter how you get there. Ordinary moral restraints on behavior just won't apply. And then finally, you don't judge actions, individual actions, or the individuals committing the actions. You only judge identities. So an oppressed person can never be evil, an aggressor or a perpetrator, but only a victim, while an oppressor is only an aggressor, perpetrator, an oppressor, and can never be a victim. What does all that have to do with the Jews? Well, since Jews on average do well by various measures, and I stress on average because there's loads of exceptions, then Jews in this ideology are white supremacist oppressors of marginalized people. Never mind, this is so false. This is so sick, this whole ideology, but this is what the ideology is. Never mind the fact that Jews are persecuted by actual white supremacists, and that many Jews are racially indistinguishable from other people of color. Since Jews do well they're automatically white supremacist oppressors. And in fact, since Jews do well on average compared to other white groups, Jews are sometimes considered to be uber white, extra white, super white, the worst of the oppressors. So if the SJP and BDS crowd labels Jews with the defamatory slur of settlers, the CRT DEI labels them with the slur of being uber white. These ideologies now fuse when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just as Western Jews are white supremacist oppressors of marginalized people here, so Israeli Jews are white supremacist oppressors of people of color, the Palestinians. Again, never mind, this is all false. It's what they believe. This is why Black Lives Matter movement automatically anti-Israel, pro-Palestine. And this is why, again, they endorse by any means necessary, because the goal is to get the equity outcome, equality of outcome. So Israeli Jews, American Jews, Western Jews, there are no innocent Jews, not in Israel, not here, not anywhere. What that means now is we can say things such as this on campuses, that we are all Hamas. This is a young woman, University of North Carolina. This rally was just a few days after October 7th here. We are all Hamas. Nobody around her seemed to disagree or even blink twice. The anti-racist ideology that dominates campuses here fuses with the Hamas program of destroying the Jews, precisely because the Israelis are the oppressors. They cannot be victims, right? And precisely because Hamas represents the Palestinians who are oppressed, they can never be perpetrators, right? That's the ideology here. We are all Hamas. We all stand for this now. And so in effect, what we've seen is all these campuses, so many students, so many professors, our academic colleagues, sophisticated, refined people who are experts in values, so they claim, right? They proclaim daily their anti-racism, their opposition to hate, their commitment to diversity, inclusion, and tolerance. The people we work with, share offices with, who teach our children, share the same basic belief and value system as the ancient and medieval Christians, the modern Nazis, and Hamas. So what do we do? And I'll wrap up on this. Just very quickly. A few options. I don't know what I recommend. Get out. Is it time to abandon the universities? Find other ones. Go to Israel for universities. Lyle Levitz had a wonderful suggestion several years ago that Israel should just make free college tuition for all American Jewish students. Should we try to reform the universities? And if we do we try to keep the DEI institution there and work with it to protect Jews? Or, as David Bernstein argues, is DEI so corrupt and anti-Jewish in its essence that we have to get rid of the DEI? Do we follow up with all these lawsuits and, of course, the pressure of alumni and donations, right, to pressure universities? Do we start our own schools? The wonderful people at the Tikva Fund are starting up they've been doing wonderful work for a good number of years now. They're starting up a middle school and high school, a traditional classical institution that looks wonderful. So I strongly recommend folks to check this out, especially if you're in the New York area and you have kids in middle school or high school. But they are literally just starting their new schools because current schools have shown they are not interested in us, Jews who don't hate Israel. Perhaps, of course, it's time to make Aliyah. That's a real thing to consider, I think, for any Jew in the diaspora, including here, to perhaps the only airport in the world where you will see these posters. I just saw a little video. They took down the two posters of the two hostages who were rescued yesterday. It was a very beautiful moment. But whichever path we choose, pretty clearly, we're going to need to pray. So I will stop there and happy to entertain questions or comments.
Okay, and Dr. Pessin, thank you for that incredibly informative, if not incredibly depressing and troubling lecture. There are many, many questions, and I'd like to say that if your question is not answered, you will be getting a resource sheet at the end of the week, and Dr. Pessin's email will be on there, and you'll be able to
Yes.
speak with him, and he's always very available and interested in responding. So there are many questions, some relating to what parents can do? What colleges? You are campus head of the Algemeyer. You have a pulse on campuses around the country. There was an interesting comment about the difference between northern colleges and western and southern colleges. Are you seeing, is it safer for students in the south or the west than it is in the north? Are you seeing any kind of pattern in terms of what's happening on the college campuses?
Thank you for that question. That's a very, very general question. So, uh, um, in general, the problem is there are problems everywhere, almost everywhere. I don't know that there's any exceptions other than maybe Yeshiva University or something like that, right, in New York. Uh, the coasts are both pretty bad, and as some of the like the big Western schools, like the Big Ten schools, University of Michigan, Ohio State, horrendous. I'm reading some things at some of the southern universities, Tulane, somewhat better, but there have been incidents at Tulane. So I think what I would recommend is this: if the question is because you have a child who's applying, my oldest is actually applying to colleges now, so it's a real question for me. Do your research. You want to get in touch with the Hillel people, and you want to get honest answers about what the environment is like on that campus. It's important to keep in mind this, October 7th is extraordinary. The war will eventually end, right? It has to. And when it ends, things will calm down again. And they haven't been pleasant for a number of years, but you shouldn't necessarily be terrified to send a kid to a campus like this. Most students, if they keep their head down, can just avoid a lot of it, right? And that might mean you have to avoid the central quad in the campus, on a regular basis because they're having rallies there. But if you're not seeing it, you can go about your business and it's okay. I mean, there have been a handful of physical assaults on different places, but I don't want people to be too afraid. So do the research. Go as you look at your top schools, talk to the people who are there, and ask, what's it like? And there are some students, this is, I was reading this beautiful thing about how prior to October 7th, a lot of people in Israel felt they had to look down a little bit about the younger generation of Israelis, and they have been so impressed that the younger generation, the ones who are serving in the army, right, in the armed forces right now, the way they have stepped up to this challenge, they're now calling them like their greatest generation, like we did with our World War II generation. There's something really beautiful about that response. And there are a good number of students who I would say they relish the challenge, but suddenly you have a meaningful thing to pursue, right? You're in college. If you're this type, I'm going to stand up for Israel. And the way I do it, I'm the only faculty member who stands up for Israel and the Jews, as I see it. Um, it's very meaningful. I have a project. I'm doing something that's valuable to me. It may not be pleasant. You're going to get some flack, but there are students who thrive here and really gain fantastic leadership skills too. So your kid. If your kid is that, then send them into the lion's den. Send them to Harvard. Send them to Columbia, which are probably the two to the worst. Send them to Penn. There's maybe three of the worst, right? If they get in, send them there because they'll have a meaningful task. If your child is the more timid type, not maybe the big Jewish leader type, then you really need to do your research and find places which are a little bit more accommodating. And if you reach out to me, I'm happy to share what I know about some specific campuses. Amcha Initiative, wonderful organization. They have been keeping a database of anti-Semitic incidents on campuses for many, many years. So you can go right online there, put in the name of a university, and they'll tell you everything that's been reported on that campus in the last, I think, about 10 years they've been doing this now. So that's a good resource that's out there as well. And I'm happy to share thoughts on particular campuses if people reach out.
So taking up on what you said about the generation and the students, one question is about why are Jewish students so prominent in the apartheid anti-Israel movements? What went wrong and why are they, why do we see so many Jewish students protesting?
Thank you for that question. And, there's a saying in the Talmud at some point, in the end of days, the enemy will be in our house. It's like it's the Jews are Jews' own worst enemies. A scholar named Edward Alexander wrote a wonderful book a few years back called Jews Against Themselves, sort of documenting the Jews who become leaders in the anti-Jewish movements, which anti-Israelism is fundamentally this. We maybe need to argue about this, but anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism is fundamentally anti-Jewish, I believe, and the large majority of Jews agrees. So How does it happen? There's lots of people speculate this is ultimately a sociological, psychological issue, but part of it is Jewish identity itself is diluting. Several generations into America, Jews are assimilating, intermarriage rates are high, religious observance is very, very low. The Jewish identity itself, at least in terms of the numbers, has become diluted. So um, if you don't sort of start off from the strong place of I am a Jew and therefore I identify with the Jewish collective, and the most important project of the Jewish collective in the past century has been the establishment of the state of Israel. If you don't have that inner fire and identity, there's very little to attach you to that, even if maybe you went to a Jewish camp or you had a little bit of Hebrew school or something like that. So I think that's part of the problem, and that's a bigger sociological phenomenon. And then, of course, because the progressive movement, the left, dominates campuses and has become so thoroughly anti-Israel, the environment that most young people are growing up in, and we've been focusing on universities. This movement is now in K through 12. It's flourishing in high schools or curricula. Again, Amcha Initiative's done a lot of work in tracking high school curricula that are just grossly anti-Israel. So it begins way earlier than colleges. We really need to begin from the ground up. So the ideology that literally our kids are steeped in schools, by the time they get to campuses, certainly all the social pressure is on the other side. It's anti-Israel. It's cool to be anti-Israel. It's hip to be pro-Palestinian. And so if you don't have that strong identity grounding you when you get to campus, and you get to campus and all the cool kids are wearing their keffiyehs and chanting anti-Israel slogans, the social pressure is enormous. I mean, college kids, amongst the most important things to them is a social life, making friends, right? And not to mention lots of anti-Israel faculty. But so the progressive movement, statistics say something like this: of all the college faculty, something like only 2% identify as conservative, like 90% identify as left or liberal or progressive, right? It's overwhelming faculty on the left side of the political spectrum, and the left is where this DEI CR2 movement has come out, which is profoundly anti-Semitic at its core. And this is what our students are being exposed to in the classroom, with the social pressure all around them. Is it any surprise that some number of them just, turn to the other side? I mean, so that's my understanding and explanation for why this is happening. The really amazing thing is that the numbers are much smaller, that they're not much bigger. That's really amazing. You would almost expect 90% of Jews at most of these students to turn. And the fact that they don't is actually wonderful. The numbers are actually small. They're very loud. They're very vocal. It feels like there's lots of them. But surveys still do show that even amongst Jewish college students, the significant majority identify with Israel, support Israel. So the numbers are small. I think they are growing. But yeah, so that's my response to that. We need to fix this problem literally from the ground up. Jewish identity has to begin, in the womb, essentially. And maybe Tikva, right? They're starting this beautiful new school. Eventually, it's going to be K through 12. Maybe that can spread to a few other cities, right? That's the kind of education maybe that will do the trick.
So here's a difficult question.
Okay.
How do you characterize Jewish students and faculty who have genuine moral criticisms of Israel and the quote occupation?
What was the first part of it? How do I characterize?
Yeah, how do you distinguish? Are there valid criticisms that one can levy against Israel at this moment? And do you lump them all together as in this anti-Semitic, anti-Jew, Jew hatred camp?
Good. Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question that needs much more time than we have, right? That's a beautiful, wonderful question. Of course, there's criticisms one can make of every government, including Israel's government. And there are many Israelis who make those criticisms all the time, and, et cetera, et cetera. But there are places where a line gets crossed. So in my view, for example, if what you're supporting is the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel, then you're passing some sort of line. Right. I don't think that's a defensible position to take. There are very earnest Jewish two-state solution people. The two-state solution is really complicated now, post October 7th, but certainly to that point, earnest people who really see that as a just and fair outcome and who could not see it in some vision of things, two states living side by side. Um, and if you think Israel is primarily to blame for the lack of reality of the Palestinian state, then I understand that those are real conversations to have, and Israelis have those conversations all the time. But I think the issue with the Jewish proponents of this, it's one thing to have these set of concerns and objections. And like I said, if you stand for the destruction of Israel, then you're not under my tent, right? Like that's too far. But if you believe in Israel and you think Israel to be its best self should live up to some better standard than it's living up to, those that's under my tent. That's fine. But the problem is when those people join forces with those who actually want the destruction of the Jewish state. So when you see a group like they call themselves Jewish Voice for Peace, chances are there's not that many Jews in them actually, and they're certainly not for peace because they are openly for the destruction of Israel. They are just the Jewish wing of the pro-Palestinian movement. If you care about Israel, then you certainly don't want to empower the enemies of Israel who seek to destroy it. And so the Jews who have those concerns, but then join forces with literally the enemies of Israel, to me, that's you know, maybe in your heart you're not anti-Semitic because you believe in Israel, you love Israel, you want it to be the best that it can be. All of that's perfectly legitimate. But there's a time and a place to make those criticisms, and to empower the enemies of Israel is to cross that line for me. And that's what we see with too many Jewish students on campuses. They are not interested in defending or supporting Israel and making Israel the best it can be. They're interested in destroying Israel. So that's a short answer, but there's a lot more to be said there.
So we're just about out of time. There are many, many more questions, and many questions for concerned parents, grandparents, of how to handle this on college campuses, what to do with administration that denies that there is a problem on college campuses. Is there a role for alums? Is there a role for
Right.
parents and grandparents on the college campus? There's a number of questions around that. Maybe you could take one quick stab at it.
Yes. So
And
let me
then
just say a couple of things. Step number one, sign up for the Allgemeiner daily newsletter so that you're informed. That's right. So we keep a close eye on the campuses and all other areas for Jews in Israel as well, but know what's going on the different campuses. Step two, if you're an alumnus or alumna of some particular place, make sure you're fully informed on what's going on your particular campus. There's a group called Alums for Campus Fairness. They're now part of the Stand With Us organization. They have a number of chapters. Alums are an under-tapped resource for the Jewish or pro-Israel crowd. Find out if there's an Alums for Campus Fairness chapter for your alma mater and get involved in that, because that chapter will be monitoring and documenting and coordinating responses. There's various responses from letter writing to withholding donations, et cetera, et cetera. In my view, it's time to stop contributing money to these colleges, but that's another conversation. But Alums for Campus Fairness is the best thing to do. And then third, what would third be? If you care about campuses, Amcha Initiative is a wonderful organization that focuses on campuses, as well as another group called Academic Engagement Network, which is trying to coordinate faculty who are, I say, supportive of Israel. There's, in AEN, I'm a member of AEN. There are plenty of AEN members who have lots to criticize about the state of Israel, right? Like that's welcome. You can be under that tent as long as you believe Israel should exist in some borders. That's okay. AEN is a wonderful organization that supports faculty. So if you're, get involved with or follow Amcha Initiative and AEN and stay informed, and Alums for Campus Fairness, those are the most immediate things you can do to get involved and hopefully support Jewish students and faculty on the campuses that matter to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Pessin. This recording will be available on our website, and also for those of you who participated, you will be getting a recording in an email at the end of the week. So our next Scholars Circle lecture features Dr. Shale Horowitz, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Shale Horowitz will be presenting Israel's Evolving Struggle for Survival, Old and New Threats, Monday, February 26th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you again, Dr. Pessin.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you for those questions.
Have a good evening, everyone.